Good morrow, ladies and gentlefolk of all descriptions. Today we're taking a look at Maelstrom by Arion Games, and I'm in the position of being in something of a quandary in that there's no real illustration to speak of in either book, so leafing through them for your education is largely pointless. So I will just leaf through anyway as I go along, just to remind myself of the things that I want to talk about. Now, this game was made in 1984, mid-80s. Very good period for British RPGs. Originally by Alexander Scott, who was at the time a rather precocious young man, shall we say. How he ever got the opportunity to produce a series of role-playing books at the time, I don't know. These were not on my radar, weirdly, while Dragon Warriors was. This is another one of those games that could be played both single-player, choose your own adventure style, or multiplayer, in the same way that some of Dragon Warriors rules were found both in Dragon Warriors and in some of the solo games that Dave Morris et al. Created. System-wise, I would say this is somewhere between Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and basic role-playing. It uses percentile-based stats, generally starting around 30 as baseline human capability, and then you have 50 odd points to spread amongst them, though you're limited to only putting 20 into any particular one maximum to start with, and human statistics typically cap out at around 95 or so, depending on your age. Anyway, these are fairly straightforward percentiles in the same kind of chance range that you would be looking at for a starting Warhammer Fantasy roleplay character, so 30 to 40% in various things. And rolls on these stats are called saving rolls. So you make those saving rolls. Maybe they're modified if you're using the advanced rules, and I strongly suggest that you do, whether it's easier or more difficult. And that's your basic sense of success or failure. Very low rolls, critical successes. Very high rolls are critical failures. And these saving throws on the stats govern pretty much everything. The character classes aren't really classes. They are called livings. And they basically determine your starting money, your starting equipment, and grant you kind of more role-playing usually than mechanical access to various things that you might be able to do. Right? So doctors can administer to people, but the subsystems are in the GM section, and it's basically just gives you access to try more than anything else. There are exceptions, of course. There is magic, but it's very low-key. It's quite free-form in a way we probably wouldn't really see otherwise until Ars Magica and Mage. But it is there, but it is very subtle. If you're trying to do anything more than, blow out a candle or something, it's going to take an enormous amount of effort. And the less subtle it is, the more likely you are to fail, the more exhausting it is, and so on. So this is very much a low magic setting. The setting is very much meant to be the real world in the 1500s. Elizabethan, towards the start of the early modern era, the Tudors, Bill Shakespeare, all that kind of stuff. That's basically the period that we're talking about here, and it is quite simulationist as a game, and it is quite gritty as a game. Combat's pretty deadly. There's some interesting quirks to the combat as well, like when you take wounds, right? You note down each individual wound. Okay, I was stabbed for 6 points. I was stabbed for 10 points. I was stabbed for 1 point. You keep track of those wounds, and you keep track of the total. When the total equals or exceeds your endurance score, you succumb to your wounds and fall unconscious. If it exceeds 100, then you cark it. I would probably change that slightly and make it so, if you take double your endurance, that's when you die. Armor takes away from damage that you suffer, but you always get to roll to defend yourself. So if someone rolls to attack and succeeds and doesn't get a critical, then you get a defense roll. And that could be modified downwards or upwards depending on equipment. If multiple people are attacking you, your defense goes down pretty quick, so you're likely to get stabbed up pretty badly in that instance. Another interesting quirk is the way in which it deals with damage. If when you're rolling damage, say I've got 3d6 for a great club and I roll 4, 5, 6, right, that would be the 4 plus the 5 is 9, but you take the 6, you take it away, and then you roll 2 dice in its place and add those on. So even very small light weapons can score large amounts of damage, and weapons that are rolling multiple dice can do catastrophic amounts of damage in a single hit. When it comes to blunt weapons as well, there's quite a neat way of dealing with subdual damage, in that with clubbing weapons, the damage doesn't add up in wounds like it normally would, rather it takes away from your endurance. So it weakens you, potentially stuns you and so on, and takes you down that way, while actual wounds are counted up the other way. So your endurance is doing double duty like that. And if you hit someone particularly hard with a club and you do over 10 damage, then you do normal damage as well. Anything that exceeds that 10 then is applied to wounds in the normal way. So that's quite neat as a way of handling things. The game is lacking in a lot of ways. It cannot be escaped. It's interesting as a historical document in terms of gaming history, particularly that in the UK. It is interesting for its simulationist approach, which is opposite to the trends in most modern play, unfortunately. So it was refreshing to read. But it's severely lacking in that it doesn't have a bestiary. Now, to be fair, most of your enemies are going to be people. And so a conventional bestiary would not be particularly useful in this game. But it doesn't have like tables of typical NPCs even. You can raid the choose your own adventure sections for the stats for some things, but there's no real separate bestiary or NPC log or anything. Wolves would be nice to have, rats would be nice to have, swarms, thugs, guardsmen, soldiers, musketeers. It would be nice to have those things, and they're all missing. Instead, we get this delightful but perhaps less important entry on herbs and their historical uses and so on, which is all well and good, but not especially useful. The companion is probably essential along with the main book. It expands on some of the character creation rules and so on in there, and it does have a very minimal bestiary for supernatural creatures. It also expands on the magic system, gives you some setting information and so on. So I would say this is probably essential. There's a beggar's companion as well. If you're playing a street level game, that's probably something you'll find particularly useful. But even so, even with the companion, it doesn't feel like a complete game. It's not something I could just pick up and run with little or no preparation, which is unfortunate. And it's not an open system, so people can't even produce these things for you, though there might be some blogs or something out there to fill in the gaps, but it's a glaringly obvious thing that's missing from the system. Alright, so scores then. I mean, style-wise, it's pretty dry. It's pretty historical, which is interesting, but style-wise, yeah, it's dry. There's barely any art apart from the bits that were seemingly taken from the old single-player stuff. But otherwise, there's not a lot there. The covers are okay. I mean, they show what they should. But even so, I don't think I can really give these books a style score of more than 2, because it is very dry, and most people aren't used to reading history books and things the same way that I am, so I think a lot of people would find this too dry. I also think that the rules aren't explained particularly well, and it would be useful to have play sheets, cheat sheets on how to play with all the various rules put together, which you don't get here, unfortunately. In terms of substance, I mean, apart from the glaring error of missing a bestiary or a NPC directory, there's a lot of interesting historical information and so on in here if you wanted to run a game in the period, or in Britain in a pseudo version of the Tudor period. So I would love to give it a 5, but I can't because of those glaring things that are missing, so that's 4. So style to substance 4, 6, 3 out of 5, bang on the average. It's interesting from a historical perspective and a system perspective, and then it's interesting to read something that is a bit more simulationist in the current sway of narrative games. And of course, any Brits are going to be playing this as Blackadder, so yeah, there you go. Zang.
In the grim, dark depths of a grim, dark mine, there's a grim, dark man with a grim, dark mind, and his grim, dark pen spends its grim, dark time scratching grim, dark tales for his grim, dark kind.